There is a tree growing within a quarter mile of where you live right now that can reduce fever, stop headaches, ease arthritis pain, and fight inflammation as effectively as any bottle of pills you could buy at a pharmacy. It costs nothing. It requires no prescription. It has been used successfully for more than 3,000 years. And if you asked 100 Americans under the age of 50 to identify it by name, maybe 2 of them could. This is not an exaggeration. This is not folklore. This is a deliberate erasure. Before 1899, if you were in pain, you had 2 choices. You could suffer, or you could use what grew. And what grew in nearly every wet ditch, along every creek bank, and beside every pond in North America was white willow, Salix alba, the same tree that lined rivers in ancient Mesopotamia, the same tree Hippocrates wrote about in 400 BC, the same tree mentioned in Egyptian medical papyri as a treatment for inflammation and fever. For thousands of years, across every continent where it grew, human beings knew what it did. They stripped the bark, boiled it, chewed it, brewed it into tea, and it worked. It worked because white willow bark contains salicin. When your body processes salicin, it converts into salicylic acid, the same compound that reduces pain and fever in modern aspirin. This is not a metaphor. This is not a distant cousin of a real medicine. This is the original source. Aspirin is the synthetic copy. The tree came first. By the mid-1800s, white willow bark was not just known in America, it was common. It appeared in home remedy books. It was recommended by rural doctors. It was harvested, dried, stored, and handed down in households the same way people stored flour and salt. If you lived outside a major city, willow bark was your aspirin. It was free. It was renewable. It required no factory and no middleman. You simply had to know which tree it was. Then, in 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working for a German company called Bayer, synthesized acetyl salicylic acid. This was salicylic acid with a slight molecular modification that made it easier to produce in a lab, easier to dose with precision, and easier to patent. 2 years later, Bayer began selling it under a brand name, Aspirin. It was marketed as modern, scientific, reliable, and clean. Everything the tree was not. And it sold. It sold faster than almost any drug in history. But here is what most people do not realize. Aspirin did not replace willow bark because willow bark stopped working. It replaced it because willow bark could not be owned. You cannot patent a tree. You cannot build a distribution monopoly around something that grows wild in every county in America. Bayer did not need to prove that aspirin was better. They only needed to prove it was standardized. And once that narrative took hold, the tree became old-fashioned. It became uncertain. It became something only backward people used. By the 1920s, American pharmaceutical companies had begun a coordinated effort to redefine what medicine was. Medicine was no longer something you made. It was something you bought. The American Medical Association began tightening its definitions of what could be recommended. Teaching hospitals stopped training doctors in botanical remedies. Pharmacopoeias, the official lists of recognized medicines, began dropping plant-based treatments in favor of synthetics. White willow bark appeared in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as late as 1926. By 1955, it was gone. It was not removed because it was dangerous. It was removed because it was irrelevant to the system being built, a system that required prescriptions, standardized production, and profit at every step. Then, in 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gave the FDA new authority to regulate what could be sold as medicine. Any substance marketed for therapeutic use now had to go through a formal approval process. That process required clinical trials, documentation, and significant money. Who was going to fund a multi-million-dollar trial for a tree bark that anyone could harvest for free? No one. So white willow, along with hundreds of other traditional remedies, simply fell out of the official record. Not because they were disproven, because they were unprofitable to prove. By the 1970s, the cultural memory had flipped entirely. Aspirin was the standard. Willow was the myth. And an entire generation grew up never knowing that the pill they swallowed had been copied from a tree their great-grandparents used without thinking twice. Here is what that means in practical terms today. The average American household spends more than $400 a year on over-the-counter pain medications. Aspirin, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, all of them descendants, in function or in concept, of that first willow compound. $400 for synthetic copies of something that still grows free in roadside drainage ditches. White willow has not gone anywhere. It still grows in 48 states. It thrives in wet soil, along stream banks, in low-lying areas that flood seasonally, and yes, in the ditches alongside rural roads. It is a fast-growing tree with long, narrow leaves, pale green on top and silvery underneath. The bark is grayish-brown and develops deep ridges as the tree matures. In early spring, before the leaves appear, it produces soft, yellowish catkins. If you have ever seen a tree near water that looks vaguely like a relative of a weeping willow but grows upright, there is a decent chance it is white willow. You harvest the bark in early spring during the rising sap, from branches 2 to 3 years old. You do not strip the entire tree. You take small sections from multiple branches so the tree survives and regenerates. You dry the bark in a cool, dark place until it is brittle. Then you store it in an airtight container. When you need it, you simmer 1 to 2 teaspoons of the dried bark in a cup of water for 10 to 15 minutes. Strain it. Drink it. It is bitter. It is not pleasant, but it works. The active dose of salicin in white willow bark typically ranges from 60 to 120 milligrams. That is roughly equivalent to a low dose of aspirin. It takes longer to feel the effect, usually 45 minutes to an hour, because your body has to convert the salicin into salicylic acid. But once it does, the relief is real. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals, including Phytotherapy Research and the American Journal of Medicine, have confirmed that white willow extract significantly reduces lower back pain, osteoarthritis symptoms, and chronic joint pain, with efficacy comparable to conventional NSAIDs. This is not fringe science. This is documented pharmacology. The only difference is that no pharmaceutical company benefits from you knowing it. And that is the pattern worth recognizing. This is not unique to willow bark. This same cycle of displacement has played out across dozens of effective, accessible plants over the last century. Elderberry, mullein, yarrow, plantain, boneset. All of them were once common knowledge. All of them were pushed to the margins, not because they failed, but because they did not fit a business model that required dependency. The FDA does not need to ban these plants outright. It only needs to make sure they are never mentioned in a clinical setting. It only needs to make sure they are absent from medical school curriculums. It only needs to make sure that when someone asks their doctor about willow bark, the response is a polite smile and a prescription pad. That is enough. In 2 generations, the knowledge disappears. But the tree does not. Right now, as inflation continues to push the cost of basic goods higher, as prescription drug prices remain completely detached from the cost of production, and as more households begin to realize that financial resilience requires reducing dependency on systems they cannot control, this kind of knowledge is not nostalgic. It is structural. Knowing that white willow grows free, that it works, and that it can be harvested and stored without refrigeration or expertise is not about rejecting modern medicine. It is about understanding that modern medicine was built on top of something older, and in some cases, just as effective. And that older system is still here. It was never actually replaced. It was just made invisible. There is power in that invisibility breaking. When you learn to identify white willow, when you harvest it correctly, dry it, store it, and use it the next time you would have reached for a bottle of aspirin, you are not playing pioneer. You are making a quiet economic decision that keeps $12 in your household instead of sending it to a corporate supply chain. Do that once a month and you have saved $144 a year. Teach it to 3 other people, and the effect multiplies. Not as a movement, just as math. This is what food security looks like when it expands beyond food. This is medicine security. This is the recognition that the systems we have been taught to depend on were designed for profit first and function second, and that in many cases, the function already existed, growing wild before the profit motive ever arrived. White willow is not a miracle. It is a tree. It has been a tree for thousands of years. The only thing that changed was whether or not you were allowed to remember what it does.